Wow, thank you so much, Darren, for that great introduction. And thank you to Thomson Reuters and all of you for having me here today. And I'd like to say a special thank you to our special guest, John Scully, who is taking time out from his world travels to join us. And he'll be with us and Thomson Reuters' own Jennifer Ablan afterward for a fireside. Okay, so I have nothing more to say after that introduction. You know, in a minute I'm going to show you, I'm so excited to share with you my stories and photos from my time documenting in Silicon Valley. But first I want to take you through some of the things he talked about. You know, over the 35 years of my career, I've been so blessed. I got to stand at the North Pole. We went on a Russian icebreaker. Don't do that. I crossed the Sahara. I explored the Amazon and found an abandoned leper colony. I covered all of those many news stories he mentioned. But a dear project of mine was 4 years documenting Mexican culture as it relates to tequila, the traditions and rituals. Sadly, I can no longer drink tequila. Photographed presidents, Bush and Clinton, and as he mentioned, a bunch of movie stars and cultural figures. My last book was on AIDS orphans in Uganda. This is actually a good news story about the transformational power of arts and education. And thanks to Liz Taylor and some other people, we were able to use this book to raise a couple $100,000 for these kids. You know, I've traveled millions of miles around the world searching for beauty and trying to understand and explain a culture, a given culture, to the wider culture. Across Asia, across Africa, Dubai and Russia, Brazil. I just remembered I have a clicker. Hello. Almost everywhere. I've been almost everywhere. There's a few places I haven't been. I've done some things. I've had a good life. But none of that matters. None of it. Because nothing in my career compares to being a witness to the digital revolution, to be in Silicon Valley, when a secretive tribe of brilliant engineers, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists sparked an explosion of innovation that changed our world forever. They proved the power of creative ideas can become reality, given enough guts and willpower and passion. Along the way, they created millions of jobs and untold wealth. But you know, I didn't really care about technology at all. I wasn't into that. I was actually brought to Silicon Valley through a different path. I came through Africa. I was sent to cover the famine in Eritrea, the conflict in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And you know, I'd seen my share of horror by that point in my career and death. But you know, I was completely unprepared for the sheer scale of this enormous human catastrophe. There was just no solution. And I really struggled to figure out how to be useful. On my return to the San Francisco Bay Area, I began looking for something more positive and more hopeful for the human race that I could cover, and that would also give meaning to my own life. That same year, Steve Jobs was forced out at Apple. From the height of fame and power, he was going to start all over, and he was going to create a supercomputer, he said, that would transform education. That got my attention. He changed the world already, and it seemed like he might do it again. The stakes were high. This was the story I was looking for. So through friends, I reached out, and I proposed to Steve this crazy idea that I would document him and his team from inception to shipping of the next computer, to capture his process of innovation and understand it. And I wanted to do it for Life magazine with complete access. Amazingly, for those of you who might know Steve, he agreed, and he gave me complete access. But being Steve, he already had the idea to document the next computer. I was in the right place at the right time. So I spent 3 years there, and as you heard, I was able to expand my project because Steve trusted me. People opened their doors, and I was able to find cool projects and go out through the valley and expand for over 15 years, shot 250,000 eggs in 70 different companies and many of the leading innovators. And because that work has been started to be preserved, I could bring you this book that you guys hopefully are enjoying. And we're hopefully going to do a documentary film. We're started an education program with the goal to inspire, educate, and challenge the next generation of entrepreneurs and innovators. So I'm going to begin my story today where I began, with Steve Jobs. Most people know about the tremendous success he had. Very few people understand that he spent a decade in struggle and failure. It was the Nobel Prize winner Paul Berg who challenged Steve at a lunch at Stanford to create a workstation for scientists. So Steve decided he was going to put a power of a mainframe in a 1-foot cube. Difficult, especially in 1985. One day this cube arrived. It was really cool, but I innocently said to Steve, "So what do you want to accomplish with this anyway?" And Steve wheeled on me and he said, "I want some kid at Stanford to cure cancer in his dorm room." And it was electrifying. I got chills because you could see in his eyes that he believed it just might be possible. And because Steve believed, his team believed. They were on this bus to the future together. When he started the company with $6 million of his own money, it got him so far, but then he needed a lifeline to keep it growing. He arranged a pitch for Ross Perot to come in, and he thought it would be cool to take him to this abandoned warehouse where he told Ross, "This is where we're going to build the world's most advanced robotic assembly line. No human hands will touch it, and we'll sell 10,000 computers a month." Ross wrote him a check for $20 million right there. Steve is saying, "Hey, everybody, let's work nights and weekends till Christmas, and then we'll take a week off." And this engineer in the back, Andy, raises his hand. He says, "Steve, we already are working nights and weekends." This is Susan Kare listening to Steve. Who is Susan Kare? She affects your lives every day and the lives of millions of people around the world because she designed the icons for the Macintosh. And later for Windows, she redesigned the Windows icons, and then OS/2 for IBM and many, many other operating systems. Just one of the many women I met that are unsung heroes of Silicon Valley. This is an actual Steve Jobs to-do list, so a look inside his brain. I like the last item. It's hard stuff. It's hard to build this stuff. You know, I've been through a lot in my career, and even so, being near Steve, even in the same room, was terrifying for me for some reason. He actually had this ability to look right into your soul and see what your vulnerabilities were, which was tough. And I knew, even though he protected me and trusted me, someday he'd turn to me and I'd have to justify what I was doing there. Who are you again? I had to figure out what I believed in and who I was, just like everyone else at Next. They had to be at the top of their game. They had to be the best in the world. And like most photojournalists, I was willing to die to take a picture that could change the world, like all of my peers. Well, that hadn't happened yet, and I realized right in front of me, the people who actually were changing the world were right there, and I could photograph them, and once I figured that out, I realized that's my purpose, that's useful, and that helped me so much to deal with Steve after that. One of my heroes is Dan Lewin, who has just been given a challenge to devise a $1 billion a year sales plan, and he's been given 20 minutes before presenting it to the company by Steve. The cliche about Steve is that he's either a genius or a jerk. That's the mythology. But Steve was like us. He was human. He was layered. He was complicated. He could be incredibly sweet. He could be incredibly generous. He could also be really, really difficult. But he'd show up to work every day just with this energy and this joy. I call this Steve Jobs pretending to be human. Seriously. This is a very, 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 very rare set of pictures of Steve working with an engineer, and this is part of his process. You know, one thing I learned, the main thing I learned watching him, was that it was all about trust and control. But with trust, he could let go. If an engineer presented an idea, he had to know that they had done their homework, that they really believed in their idea. But if he didn't like it or he didn't trust them, he just didn't think it was right, he could attack. And he would start shouting, "This is stupid. This is the stupidest freaking thing I've ever seen." His language was much more colorful. But if the engineer had character, if they believed in their idea, if they'd done their homework, they would stand up to him and say, "Screw you, Steve." And they would just calmly say, "You're wrong, and here's why." And Steve would shout, "This is stupid." "No, it's not. This is stupid." It could go back and forth like that for maybe 10 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe 15, until suddenly a switch would flip in his brain, and he would just smile that charming smile, and he'd go, "Okay, great." And he'd turn to the next victim. I'm not condoning bad behavior, but most of the time it was about Steve getting these incredibly talented, brilliant people he'd gathered from all over the world to rise above the limitations of that considerable talent and do what he wanted them to do to make this thing better. It was really about making this impossible thing. This is Susan Rockrise in a rough clip. I just threw this in of her talking about trust and Steve. This is where Michael Chow, John and I were talking about the Newton demos where if something went wrong, Michael Chow would go, "Imagine if you will." She says some really cool stuff. Okay. You guys give me a signal. Yeah, it's plugged in. Here we go.
I have another theory about trust with Steve, and that is that in my own reading and learning about human behavior and interaction with people, I have a phrase that sort of says, hurt people hurt people. And so Steve, for me, as an orphan from his living parents, separated from his biological sister, starts a company, needs to find a way to communicate his emotion, creates machines that are able to be utilized by mere mortals, that are not about communicating about numbers and spreadsheets. They're about communicating the senses and the artistic truth of the individual. It's almost as if these people have a chance to scream their truth through these amazingly easy to use tools based on some need inside of him to tell the truth emotionally that somehow he may have gotten to before he died. I don't know. He gets to Apple and he hires somebody based on what he believes is the right thing to do, which is John Sculley for consumer marketing reasons. He wants somebody to help him break through. So technology from Apple's not just technology. And then, boom, he gets outed from the company he found. So that's two orphan experiences. One from his biological family and one from his own company. So by that time, at less than 40 years of age, there's no way in the world that man's going to trust easily.
Yes, Steve felt hurt and betrayed. I heard him talk about it all the time. But that's not how it really went down. There was no betrayal by Apple, certainly not by John Sculley. If anything, Steve betrayed himself that last chaotic year. The reality is always more complex, and I'll come back to this later. But I loved how Susan Rockrise articulates the whole story, really. Inventing tools to unleash human creativity. That's the story. This is just about light. I don't really have a reason to show that. Jumping ahead, John mentioned earlier what a great negotiator Steve was, and most people don't realize that. By 1989, he had run out of money. The company was on the ropes. They hadn't even built their first computer yet. And he arranged for a meeting with Canon. He wanted to raise $100 million. He heard beforehand that they were going to offer him only 50 for twice the shares that he was going to give. So he comes in a sweater vest, already alienating everybody, and he starts making 6 ridiculous, unreasonable demands, one after the other, that had nothing to do with the agenda. And the chairman of Canon, after like an hour of this, says, "I need a break," and they go out. Steve turns to his team and he says, "You guys have screwed up this deal." And he runs out. And everybody's looking at each other. A few minutes later, they come back in, and Canon begins attacking Steve hard. And one by one, he unwinds those 6 demands that they took very seriously. Little by little, finally, after about another hour or maybe 2, yay, Canon has crushed the mighty Steve Jobs. They're victorious. They've won. A weird thing happened. The energy just shifted right back across the table. they were going to lose face. They had to throw him a bone. Steve got the $100 million plus the robots he had promised Ross Perot. Secrecy was paramount, even in Steve's office before the launch. So after many years of backbreaking labor, they launched the product in 1988 in San Francisco and DC, and it was a huge success. They had over 80 covers of magazines. They didn't realize it was running backstage. It was running on a Sun workstation backstage. It didn't quite work yet. And when they finally shipped, it was too late and way overpriced for their higher education market. Yet, the elegant operating system was 10 years ahead of its time. The hardware failed, the factory shut down. Steve was devastated, but he never gave up on that operating system, thus sowing the seeds of his future redemption when Apple bought it later. And as most of you know, the OS in every Apple product today was originally based on the Next operating system. Taking a deep breath. I always get tense telling that story. In 1991, I asked and got permission from John Sculley to document the Newton project at Apple. By this time, John had built Apple into the most profitable computer company in the world. But he was also looking hard for new ideas and new revenue inside the company. Windows was growing fast, margins were dropping. And he found the Newton team, kind of a rebel unit, developing this new handheld device. It was a computing communications device. And he funded them and supported them. And John hoped this would open a new market, a whole new market for Apple. And I've noticed John has been criticized often in the press over the last decades for pushing Steve out or forcing Steve out. But as I mentioned earlier, the truth is much more complicated, and Steve's leaving was a long, complicated, self-destructive on his part process. There were many disputes, and one of the most dramatic came to a head when Steve told John they had to kill the advertising, all the advertising for the Apple II series. And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but he had to kill the advertising because guess what? The new Mac that was so sexy and everything, it was dead in the water. It was failing bad by the spring of '85. I don't know if you guys remember that. So he wanted to take all the advertising from the one product that was driving revenue, 70%, I think, of Apple's revenue, and kill it and put it on the Mac that was doomed at that time. And John said, absolutely not. He had a fiduciary responsibility. I think he might have said, over my dead body, or something to that effect. And Steve was furious and said, I'm going to go to the board and have you fired. And John said, go ahead. And the board backed John. That part of the movie is true. And Steve was out. But yet, after Steve left, John grew Apple from when he joined the company in '83, around $900 million in revenue, to over $8 billion in revenue by 1993, when he himself was forced out. He more than fulfilled the promise to break through to consumers. This is the great Wozniak showing the first Game Boy to John. He doesn't get enough credit for having really launched the personal computer revolution. Another thing that was interesting at Apple, I walked around all these startups in the Valley, but at Apple I started to see women engineers on the Newton team and women managers. And this was under John's leadership. This woman, Sarah Clark, had a baby, and she never left the building that I could see for like 2 years. She would breastfeed behind a blanket in her cube, sleep while the code was compiling. I mean, this is dedication. And I started to think, so why does diversity matter? Is it social justice? Of course. But it's also power. Whoever writes the code controls the machine, which impacts the user behavior and the entire culture. Worldview matters. And it also makes more money, according to 3 studies about companies that have women on their boards. So a couple years in, the Newton team was burning out. It was really rough. They only had 30 people writing 1 million lines of code. Compare that to Windows NT, where they had 400 people over 5 years. I don't know if they actually ever finished that. But anyway, this was a very, very elegant OS. And this young man, Kohei Sono, I was going to tell you. So This was a really tough project, inventing a new technology for a new market that didn't exist. And for very good reasons, they decided to switch chips. And they told the team, you guys have to write the code all over again. You got another year. Ko Isono, who had been working day and night on the inker for the handwriting, 27 years old, had just been married, went home, loaded a pistol, and he shot himself in the heart. And it was devastating for all of us, for the team. And I just don't think the sacrifice required to build this technology we all take for granted is well understood outside the Valley or where people build it. The team rallied, though. This is Michael Chow, pulled everyone together. They worked through Christmas, and they were able to make the deadline and launch on time. And it was a cathartic, absolutely astonishing, fantastic launch, dedicated to Ko. It was a triumph. But you know what? The Newton shipped too early, and it never fulfilled expectations. And again, it was new technologies for a new market. But again, with the Newton, John's vision was vindicated. He announced in 1992 at CES that someday millions of people would have handheld, powerful computing devices in their pockets. And what happened is the Newton paved the way for the Palm Pilot and later the iPhone and the iPad. That's what I call visionary. So we're talking about an era that had a flourishing of human creativity equal or greater than any time in human history. It was truly a renaissance in Silicon Valley. The culture had to change at these companies to attract talent or be left behind. I studied visual anthropology briefly in college, and as I got into this story more and more, I felt like I was discovering a hidden tribe, inventing a new language and a new culture to support the development of the new technology. And Russell Brown, the creative director at Adobe, was certainly one of the tribal leaders, still there. This is the great painter David Hockney taking the first Photoshop class in 1990. This was like Paris in the 20s, where artists would come in. You'd see artists of all kinds at Adobe and Apple. They wanted to know about new tools that could improve or give them an edge with their art. Just like real estate, the artists are first. Think lofts. This is symbolic. If they were to have sex, this is how it might look. So this new culture of innovation, they blew up the rigid corporate structure and allowed your personality to be expressed. Creativity soared, innovation followed. But I also noticed that without accountability, limitations, and structure, creativity never got a product shipped. There has to be this balance. It's like Zen. It's like controlled chaos. Very hard. Without the investors, you don't get the technology. And without idealistic, super smart investors, you don't get to change the world as these guys did. This is John Doerr at the Kleiner Perkins super famous Monday morning meeting. And if you were an entrepreneur in the Valley, this is the room where you wanted to make your elevator pitch. Genentech, Compaq, Sun, Netscape, AOL, Amazon, Google and Twitter, many, many companies you know, they funded and nurtured. And they had long-term faith in their companies. Amazon took 5 years to make a profit. Clinton knew where the power had shifted by 95, absolutely. The whole economy was being fired by Silicon Valley at that point. My wife Therese and I went to the Aspen Kleiner Perkins gathering, and she saw this guy wearing an Amazon t-shirt. And she's Brazilian. She's like, what's that? Let's go talk to that guy. So, she's bored. So we find ourselves alone with Jeff Bezos going up Aspen Mountain on a gondola, and he practices his pitch on us the whole 20 minutes up the mountain. And we get to the top, and he says, so what do you think? I'm like, amazing, it's going to be huge. Even we could see it was going to be astonishing. You know, it was amazing. But I said to Jeff, you're going to kill my local bookstore. No. The other Amazon, he's saying to Vinod Khosla here. He raised $8 million from Kleiner that year. He had started out with friends and family money, and once Kleiner got in, it took off like a rocket. This next set of pictures are some of my favorites from inside these disruptors. Companies were growing so fast and disrupting existing companies, especially this guy, Bill Gates. Bill is saying at the TED 3 conference, in the future with digital technology, no one should ever pay more than $50 for a photo. Thanks, Bill. Thus beginning the complete disruption of the trade practices of my industry. You know, he was a devil then, but I love what he's doing now with Melinda and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They are truly doing amazing stuff. So, this is not strategic. These are the golf courses that the CEO, Scott McNeely, wants to play. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Intel's most advanced fab, where they built the Pentium chip, is in New Mexico, and these are mostly Pueblo Indians who build that chip on a work break. Mark Andreessen here is at the height of Netscape's glory. They came from 0 to 95% of the market in a year. This is a crucial time in Silicon Valley history. This is a tipping point, because when they did their IPO in 1995, they were the first startup or the first company to do an IPO without profits. It turned the whole economics thing on its head, and it incited a craze for IPOs that changed the priority from everyone from inventing the technology to preparing for and selling the IPO. The product could get figured out later, if ever. Unfortunately for Netscape, a year later they were down from 95% to 1%, and then they were done. And it was fun, like I said, for a while. But time was running out for this startup. This is Samir Arora at NetObjects. This is the last story I documented in my 15 years. And again, it involves Microsoft, because they had gotten into his market, and his two investors are saying to him, you know what, Samir, we're going in a different direction. You're done. You're fired. He refused to go. He refused to sign and take his shares and go. He broke the mold of the archetype. He broke the archetype of the visionary founder leaving. So they cut off his funds. It was Friday afternoon, and he had to stand before 150 employees who'd been working around the clock for years for shares and tell them the bad news. And he said, whoever can work for free, please stay. He went home and began dialing for dollars, and by noon Monday, he had $10 million in the bank. It was a miracle. The company was saved. The best part of the story, 2 months later, he sells the company to IBM for $100 million. He brings everyone back in on the deal, and they made 1,000% IRR. You know, Samir brings together many of the strands of the digital revolution because he was such an accomplished entrepreneur, a master. Although there is a slight footnote in that a year later, IBM took the company public at the height of the bubble, and a very nervous market gave them a very, very poor reception. CNN came on at the end of the day, and they said, is this the beginning of the end of the dot-com bubble? And it was. A year later, in 2000, after a year of unsuccessful IPOs, the market collapsed. Silicon Valley collapsed. Trillions of shareholder dollars washed away. And I watched that noble cause that Steve and John talked about shift into this crazy, mad gold rush. Greed fails, basically. It was no longer compelling, and I ended my project. But ironically, as Silicon Valley was crashing, Steve Jobs is rising up like the phoenix to glory. Despite a decade of difficulty, Steve kept that operating system alive, and Apple shows up in '96 and buys it for $400 million. He gets a seat on the board, and he begins the most incredible comeback in American business history. And where did Apple get that money? They were broke. Their stock had crashed. They were technically bankrupt. They discovered that they owned some super valuable stock in a chip company called ARM, which they sold for around $800 million, giving Steve half and keeping half to keep the lights on. But where did they get that equity in ARM? It was John Sculley, who discovered a team of scientists at Cambridge during the Newton project, inventing this incredible radical chip technology, and he funded them. Today, ARM technology is in 85% of the world's mobile devices. You could make the argument that there would have been no Apple for Steve to come home to had John not made that investment in ARM. So before I end, there's a few things, 3 or 4 or 5 things I can't stop thinking about that I want to share with you. So what's next? For starters, there's this huge, massive new wave, as David described the wave cycle, coming at us with all this incredible new technology from robotics and sensors and genomics and 3D and quantum computing, AI, machine learning. There's just a lot of really cool stuff. Some of it is starting to scale. Most of it has not scaled yet. We're kind of at a maturing cycle of the last wave cycle. So along with that, though, is a whole new generation of really hungry, exciting, brilliant entrepreneurs and innovators. So that's the good news, because I think this next wave is going to blow away the last wave. But the singularity is coming too. Maybe not such good news. It might bring great technology, but we will then upload our brains into a hive mind and live forever, which could be really cool. Some of you might think that's really cool, and some might think it's utterly terrifying. Either way, I just think we need more public dialogue around technology development. We didn't get a vote on that atom bomb thing, or even if we wanted to type our keyboards with our thumbs on tiny, tiny keyboards. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. But I think there has to be more awareness. We have a role to play, even if it's just voicing opinions on Facebook. And speaking of social media, as much as I love social media for the community that it brings, which is incredible, I do worry, and I think a lot of people are worried about the consolidation of big data power in just a few silos. I think it's just a question we need to talk about. I have a few other concerns. Our education system is not actually turning out enough engineers to meet the demands in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. China and other countries are leaving us way behind. The other thing I noticed since my time in the Valley is that since 2000, the general trend of investments has been more short-term, getting money out in 18 to 24 months in many cases, in which case you only have time to develop apps or games. It's really, really hard today to go to Silicon Valley and get funding for hard science, for really tough problems that might be like solving climate change, which selfishly I would love to see happen. So if anything is possible in the future, how do we build the best possible future? How do we design that? And I think it's looking at the past is helpful. Since the future is shaped by the past, history really matters. Innovators today need to study their history. They need to look back to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, but also to see new opportunities. You better believe Steve Jobs knew his history and upon whose shoulders he stood. He knew who Bob Noyce was. He knew who Claude Shannon was. He knew who Ada Lovelace was. Who knows who Ada Lovelace was? Okay, the first programmer happened to be a woman in 1841. He gathered lots of role models, and he would just drive them crazy trying to find out everything they knew and what they had done, and then he would learn about what they thought was coming next. So who will be the next Steve Jobs? And where will she come from? Well, she could come from anywhere. It could be India, the US, Sweden, China, Brazil. This is the most important lesson I learned from Steve. Seems obvious, really, really hard. He was willing to go over that cliff into oblivion. He burned through his entire savings almost before he was saved. You have to know who you are, what you believe in, and against all evidence to the contrary, believe in your idea and never, ever give up. And if you do this, you'll probably fail. But if you don't do it, you will never hit it out of the park. That's the lesson. During the dot-com boom, a VC came up to me and said, you know, we don't really have a product, but we're going to be so rich soon because we're doing our IPO. That didn't work out so well. Greed fails, as I said. And recently, a millennial entrepreneur told me about her startup. She was really excited telling me about it. And I said, is this the most important thing in your life? And she said, no. As soon as we make money, I'm going to go to Bali and figure out the meaning of my life. You know, she wanted more. Everyone does. Every single one of us someday will wake up and look in the mirror and wonder if we're on the right path and what we're doing with our lives. And the lesson I take from a lot of these Fearless Genius stories is if you want to create meaning in your life, you have to figure out what it is that you're incredibly obsessed with and passionate about. What are you willing to sacrifice everything for, including your life? You have to align your passion with your work. The people I photographed were on a mission. They wanted to invent technology that would improve our lives. Why is it so important to have a mission? Because inventing new technology is ridiculously, breathtakingly hard. Money alone is just not enough to walk through that fire. You don't have to be a genius, but you do have to be fearless. And many of you in this room have already impacted the world. Others of you are working really hard to do just that. And if you succeed, you may change lives. What you do matters. And this Fearless Genius story, this is as much your story as anyone's. This is your tribe. So let's go out and catch that next wave, the next revolution. Let's fight for the biggest ideas, and let's fulfill the promises of the last revolution. Thank you all so much.